Yeah, just a brief introduction to myself. Substitution for today for Charlie, but I'll cover what we need to go over really. So I'm Iwan Vaughan, but a background to myself, as I'm saying, dairy farmer and sheep farmer from Mid Wales, but I'm also a partner in Dairy Diagnosis, which offer dairy nutrition consultancy, also beef as well, and also trade and wholesale various feeds and from there really. So today we'll give you a presentation just on clover silage and how to utilise them within the diets, both on a TMR system and grazing systems as well. So the key topics I want to cover really is maximising forage intakes, trying to get as much forage as we can into these animals, how to displace bought-in protein with homegrown protein into the diets, increasing N utilisation, so how can we reduce the amount of total protein we're feeding but get more out, how to use clover-based silage in TMR, and then how to get the most out of clover in the grazing swards. So why clover? The main reason why everybody looks at clover is for the high protein content, and we'll go over that. But that is to replace the majority of purchased protein requirements. There's also for clover as well as real high digestibility, so we can real drive intakes. And that NDF is very digestible, so that breaks down very quickly in the rumen, so then we can increase intakes. More intakes equals more milk, increased profitability as well. There is low fermentable carbohydrates in that diet, so we've got to match that up within the rumen on a TMR system or any supplementation that we do feed as well. Just shown on the bottom there, the average results of red clover silages from Trow Nutrition in the last 12 months, or in 2023. So as you can see there, if you look at an analysis of red clover, first thing you'll pick up on is the high protein. That's relatively low at 16 or just 17 protein. It's usually nearer the 20 mark. But what you would see is a low ME and a low D value. That is not really the case. So in terms of, we were reading about it before really, in terms of if you're looking at the calibration of wet NIR analysis, which majority of people do, there probably isn't that. There probably isn't the volume of samples going through of red clover to give it an accurate example. So the animal will always outperform the analysis on any legume analysis. So it's just making sure you're aware of that, and the cow will tell you how good it is. So we can work around that again. So red or white clover and where do they fit in? So red clover, as we've just gone through, or the ones which sat through Rumen's talk then, in terms of red clover will offer you real high crude protein in your forage. And that's what we're looking at here, really. There's going to be a greater proportion of bypass because that rumen throughput would be far quicker going and passing through a greater bypass protein into the abomasum and then into the small intestine for absorption, which we'll go over after. We'll also have increased digestibility off the back of red clover rather than your perennial ryegrass white clover swards. And then we'll get that increased rumen output. So it's passing through the rumen far quicker. And then we can utilise that, meaning there's higher dry matter intakes. White clover does work great within a grass sward. So if you've got perennial ryegrass, make sure you're getting the clover back in there if it hasn't been put in there already. Will increase crude protein off the back of your silage and increase digestibility as well. And in terms of a grazing lay, there's no doubt clover comes into its own there, and we'll go through that information as well later on. So in terms of when I'm first looking out to set up a TMR, or just to get an indication, how many of you feed TMRs, or how many of you are indoor-based herds? And how many of you are spring calvers in effect? Yeah, and then in terms of more TMR in the winter, graze in the summer, I suppose that'd be the majority as well, would it, really? Yeah, so just an indication of where you are and where the questions need to go, really. So in terms of when I would always set out with diet, regardless of the system, is we want to maximise the amount of homegrown forage that goes into that diet. So that would then maximise milk from forage, if either that's per cow or even per hectare, if we're trying to maximise number of animals on the ground as well. So we need to maximise potential forage intake. So how do we do that? We need to get total NDF. We need to manage total NDF intakes, making sure the majority of that is coming from forage, to try and maximise that as high as we can. By looking at total forage NDFs, we can do that, and then total UNDF intakes as well, so that's undigestible fibre. So in terms of cutting times, if we delay cutting times, just as Rumen just said, even if that's from 4 weeks to 5 weeks to 6 weeks, ME drops, NDF increases, but also UNDF increases, which is pretty much the lignin factor of your silage. So as that increases, we're reducing the potential of silage intakes. So that would turn then, so my target would be over 14 kilos dry matter intake of forage into a diet. Well, that could be on an 8,000 litre herd giving 28 to 30 litres, or that could be on a 3X herd giving 42 litres. You still need to maintain that intake of 14 kilos. So we need to be up at around 55% or above the diet as forage, and that would be your target. Most forages this year, we've seen, as example this year, we've had poor intakes of silages off a poor summer last year. Very poor milk results off the back of it. Really, probably cows have eaten 2 kilos less dry matter intake, and that's all off the back of what we just talked about. So unless we've increased concentrates by 2 or 3 kilos, we've probably seen a drop in intakes off the back, a drop in milk yield off the back of it. So forage requirements. What we need in the clamp to feed is very highly digestible forages, low NDF, and very high NDF degradability, something that's going to break down very quick in the rumen. Everything we've just spoken about, red clover delivers that if we can get that right, if we can get it cut right at the right time. So to supplement them, that diet after, use of high quality raw materials. If you're going for cheaper raw materials in terms of your supplemented feed, all you're doing is filling that cow up too quick, so you're restricting the amount of forage that she can eat. So just make sure that's fine. So if we're doing all that and increasing forage dry matter intakes, we're increasing total milk solid yields without the need for putting expensive raw materials in like C16 fats, and we're reducing in total purchase feed costs because we're buying in less concentrates to fill that cow up. But off the back of that, we need to grow more silage as well. So just keep that in mind of where we're going. If you've got good quality silage in the pit, it goes far quicker because the cows are eating more of it. So just keep that in mind. So protein. Start off with protein. I was lucky enough to actually do an Nuffield scholarship on low protein diets back a few years ago. So in terms of, I'll bring that in quite a bit in today's talk as well, really. So amino acids, they're the building blocks of protein. And the way that we measure protein, or crude protein, as any feed or silage analysis or anything like that, is by measuring nitrogen. Because nitrogen there's a molecule of nitrogen in every amino acid. And that's calculated about 16% of that amino acid compound. So all we do to measure crude protein is measure the nitrogen and then times by 6.25. So that is your measure. So there's no relation to quality or amino acid profile or anything in that crude protein percentage. So you could have urea, which is 270% crude protein, or you could have soya, which is 48% crude protein. So like in terms of, I know which one I'd rather feed, but like in terms of crude protein, it's a very crude way, as you should say, of presenting protein. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So as we feed crude protein to a cow, so crude protein is essentially nitrogen, as we're saying. So as an animal takes that in, so that diet could be anywhere from 16% to 24-25% if she's just eating grazed grass. Only 20 to 30% of that protein she eats will actually be converted into a saleable protein product, such as milk protein or meat, if we're looking at a beef animal. The rest will be excreted either as urea in the urine or urea in the milk as well, or in the feces as well. So that is wasted, that's going straight through them. So if any of you ALA producers, ALA members, is there any here? Yeah, so you all know about protein efficiency and how we're getting that on the big 5 scale. So that is pretty much protein intake divided by, protein output divided by protein intake, and that's your percentage. So if you're over 0.32, I think we're getting the top marks. If we're under 0.25, we're getting lower down. So in terms of that gives you indication, and that's where the market is heading in terms of being more efficient in our protein use. So when I was over in New Zealand, I met with Dr. Jim Gibbs from Lincoln University, and he mentioned the amount of N utilised is constant regardless of the N we feed. Changes to the diet won't increase how much N the cow utilised, but a reduction in N intake will increase utilisation. So that means in terms of if we're loading the diet with too much nitrogen or too much crude protein, the cow won't use any more, she's actually getting rid of it. So we need to maximise or increase efficiency of the protein we're using, because protein is expensive to buy in, and make sure we're not putting too much into the diet. But I did challenge, can we utilise more of that nitrogen within the diet by the way we feed them or supplement them as well? So I won't go through all that in detail, but in terms of, instead of looking at crude protein, we need to understand how we actually feed that protein to the animal. So when we feed protein, we don't actually feed the animal, we actually feed the rumen bugs. So the rumen bugs, the protein goes in either as straight amino acids or ammonia, straight nitrogen, or ammonia nitrogen, which is bound amino acids within, or like RDP as you should call it, and we feed carbohydrates. So that nitrogen, the carbohydrates feed the bugs, that creates microbial protein, which then gets flushed to the small intestine. So that is pretty much the buildup of bugs in the rumen. That gets flushed to the small intestine, and that's what's available to the animal as microbial protein, or metabolizable protein, sorry. We've also feed bypass as well. So we feed bypass protein, which flushes straight through the rumen into the small intestine, and that's available as amino acids there as well. So from the small intestine, them amino acids are available to be utilised. Muscles, milk, mammary, they get used everywhere. I should mention as well, through this fermentation here, the loss is ammonia. So if we're feeding too much nitrogen, we lose that out the rumen, and that gets converted into urea in the liver and gets excreted either in the milk or urea as well. So that just gives you a brief outline, quick, just in terms of what is happening inside that cow and where we need to target the protein. So milk, urea, nitrogens. So we all get a text in terms of what level of milk, urea, nitrogen is in our milk every day or every other day or wherever we get the text, possibly weekly. So there's 3 ways that it can be put across, and that's, so if you see a 0.02 or 200 or 20, they all mean the same thing. So different companies will send different markers out. So let's work on 200 urea, that's milligrams a litre. So if we then talk about, that is an indication of either a surplus or too much or too little protein within the diet. So that milk, urea, nitrogen is a sign of wasted protein. So it's a figure which some people used to target higher milk ureas would mean more milk. To me, that's a negative way of looking at it. We should be looking at making the cow more efficient and drop that down. If we're running milk ureas too high, it's a very inefficient way of doing it, and it's actually at an energy cost to the cow, because she's got to use energy up to then get rid of that milk urea. So in terms of where do we target, too high milk ureas is over 280. That means we've got too much readily available nitrogen or protein within the rumen. We can either then reduce the protein, or we need to increase fermentable carbohydrates to utilise more of that protein within the rumen. On the other end as well, if it's too low, if it's under about 180, that is a sign that there's not enough crude protein or nitrogen within that diet. Or if the cows are flying and they're milking well, it means you're very efficient, and I wouldn't touch it then. But in terms of if there is a lack in performance and they're not performing well, it's at that point you then need to add more crude protein to the diet to up rumen ammonia and get that animal performing. So where I would target, anywhere between 180 and 240. That's where I would target. On a grazing diet, it can be all over the place, because it all depends on what the nitrogen uptake of that grass in, if it's wet, if it's dry, and also when you spread fert as well. So you could get a milk urea of 400, a week later you could be down at 200. So in terms of, we could look at utilisation of, right, do you go in with a 12% crude protein compound to utilise that grass, or do you go in with a 16? Problem is, with a lot of grazers, you're probably not, by the time you've changed that load of nuts, that milk urea could have changed again. So it's just, you've just got to balance it out. Probably like a 14 to a 16 through that grazing season is a fair bet. At the minute, I take it all grazers are having some lot of silage. There must be. You probably need to be higher than that at the minute as well, because there isn't a lot of nitrogen uptake in that grass at the minute. So very low milk ureas. So yeah, we're lucky enough to live in an area where we can grow a lot of grass, a lot of clover as well. So we need to utilise that to our best utilisation. So grass and clover, when grown, that tissue is very high in nitrogen, so very high in crude protein. So as we've just gone through that presentation with Rumen as well, making sure you cut at the right time, make sure that's in the clamp, that is harvested at the right time, and it's in the clamp to be fed out correctly with minimal losses. What we do see on UK diets though, if we've got very high So if we're on grass silage or grazing alone, and it's very high crude protein, we then put minimal, so this is a rumen, we put the nitrogen very high. We then put limited amount of carbohydrates into that diet because we're worried about acid load, we're worried about acidosis, we don't want our fats to drop. So you then get a small amount of microbial protein, or not enough microbial protein produced. So a lot of urea leaving the rumen. So if we're seeing that very high milk ureas of 300s, that's what is happening in that picture there. So in that circumstance, whatever you're feeding, and I'm not saying you need to supplement feed, because if you're grass wedge or you've got enough grass in that system, it's a cost to feed concentrates. But if you have to bring dry matter in terms of concentrates or any forage in terms of maize, silage or anything like that, make sure it's the right stuff and make sure it can be high in crude, low in crude protein and high in fermentable carbohydrates to utilise as much of that nitrogen as we can. So in terms of how do we do it, exactly as I've just said really, reduce the amount of nitrogen if we can in the total diet, increase the carbohydrates, increase microbial protein yield, reduce the ammonia loss out the rumen as milk ureas. So that would be the perfect scenario, and we try to work to that. Where have I gone now? There we go. Right. So when I was also on my Nufford travels, I was on Cornell University. So this is, I met with Professor Mike Van Amberg from Cornell University. And first thing, so I was talking about this, increasing starch and sugars, make sure we utilising, increasing microbial protein yield. First thing he said to me, before we start feeding the cow, we've got to understand NDF. So we've got to understand neutral detergent fibre and what we're feeding that animal. And that will allow you to feed starch safely going forward. So their model, the Cornell model, the Cornell net carbohydrate and protein system, this looks at breaking NDF, so fibre, down into 3 different pools. So that's fast pool, slow pool, and UNDF. So it's your undegradable NDF. So that means what's the rate of degradability of them fibres. So that'll tell you and give you a better prediction of what's going to happen within that rumen, rather than just looking at the standard NDF on your wet NIR analysis. So to give you an idea, I also spoke to Mike Deneen from Chegas as well, who was doing a PhD in Cornell at the time. So looking at the degradability of spring versus autumn perennial ryegrass. So obviously clover would work quite similar, but it's probably more that rapid degradability. But as you can see, spring grass is far more degradable, or degrades far quicker than autumn grass. If you also had a midsummer, it would probably be slower still. So that gives you an indication of why your first cut, if you have exactly the same analysis, so your first cut, second cut, third cut are all 11 ME or 11.5 ME. They're all, 420 grams of NDF, and they're all 17 protein. That's why your first cut will always outperform your second or third cuts, and maybe your third or fourth cut, whichever comes in that late August, September period, will outperform that mid-season cut as well, because of the degradability of the fibre. So why do we need to understand fibre? If I can put the right amount of fibre into the diet, along with the starch and sugars, we're reducing the risk of SARA, so reducing the risk of acidosis. And it also gives us an indication of, if we need any, which fibres to use. Do we use sugar beet? Do we use soya hulls? Do we use anything else which comes in? Do we use straw? And what that level is anyway. So what else can we do to understand or try and reduce that acid loading? The types of starch and sugars we want, or the types of carbohydrates we need. Do we use maize as in ground maize, or do we use wheat? Do we use barley? Which one ferments better? Do we use sugar instead? Or do we use a fermentable carbohydrate source like sugar beet to try and reduce that acid load as well? And do we look at buffers to try and make sure that we're not overloading that rumen and causing acidosis off the back of it? So when we're looking at diets, we need to make sure. So what you usually see when you're loading a lot of crude protein from legume silages into diets, that you're getting enough ME in there and you get enough nitrogen, so you've got enough total crude protein in there, but we're not meeting milk from MP supply. So we're not meeting that supply from MP. So when we're looking at diets, we we need to put enough energy into the diet, so that's milk from ME. Then we need to put enough metabolizable protein, having that output in the small intestine. So whatever is, so if we put enough energy in for 35 litres, but we're only having enough output of MP for 31 litres, it's 31 litres we're going to have. So them cows will go a bit fat, possibly. If it's the other way around, it was always be the limiting factor. So whichever one's lowest, that's where they'll milk. So make sure we need to increase that. And on these UK-based forages, it's usually we've got enough crude protein in the diet, but we need to increase bypass. There is issues obviously around soya at the minute that we can use and what the availability of that will be going forward, but we need to still increase bypass. So is that the use of protected proteins, rate meals, or is it the likes of prairie meal and things like that as well that we're increasing utilisation? But what I'd say first is we need to maximise microbial protein production, what we can get out of that rumen, and then add bypass where we need it. Amino acid supply, so for your top end herds which produce in a lot of milk, 11,000-12,000 litres, we need to start looking at amino acid profiles as well and making sure we're matching, especially methionine and lysine up to the correct ratios, just to make sure we're fine on that as well. And then at that time, we can push that crude protein far lower as well. So just example diets for you, just in terms of where we're sitting. So there's 3 diets there, one with maize silage and grass silage, one with red clover, maize silage and grass silage, and one with red clover and grass silage, just to give you that indication. Maize silage, it's far easier to balance a diet with high crude protein silages with maize silage within that diet, because it does bring it down, it adds starch in safely. But I know, well, further west from here, we're probably going to struggle to grow as much maize as you would do around here, really. So, so give you an indication where we're sitting. These are different diets, but just to show you along the top, that diet cost is only purchase concentrate cost. That's not including forage costs. We did the same talk last week where it was mentioned by David Davis that red clover silage would be far cheaper to produce because of the nitrogen input. So that would further reduce your diet as well, really. So in terms of what that shows is you can get a cheaper diet off feeding red clover. Then I ran the same diet, so this is including first cut maize silage and red clover, but then tried to reduce crude protein from 17.5 down to 16 without using soya. So it gives you an indication of how you can do it, but all you need is bypass protein. So you need to put a lot of protected rate meal in there, and you need to put prairie meal in there to match it. So if you look at every time you're looking at milk from ME, milk from MP, they need to be the same all the time. And the crude protein then, 17.5 versus 16. Lower cost of the diet, you'll have a healthier, far more productive cow off the back of it as well. And that's with no soya in it as well, if your contract requires it as well. So just back of grazing as well. So you can increase milk solids and milk yields off the back of grazing, clover, grass and clover lays. We need to supplement when necessary. So like I was saying before, you don't always have to go in and supplement grass and clover lays, but when you do, make sure you're feeding the right stuff. So, if we can do it safely, high fermentable carbohydrate concentrates with only bypass protein if you've got to feed any protein within it at all, just to match that up. Do we need and balance that fibre up as well. Just a bit of work from Cheggist on the bottom in terms of grass clover lays at 150 kilos of N per hectare versus 250 kilos of N per hectare versus just grass diet alone. Milk solid yield per cow, you can see, milk yield in total is higher. Milk solids per cow is much higher off a mixed sward rather than a grass only sward. So it just shows you can do it off both systems as well. Just a matter of time because I'm pushing on now. So summary, just to try and get the most out of clover in both silage and grazing systems. Key take-home messages would be to increase output from homegrown forages, increase forage dry matter intakes to the best you can, reduce reliance on purchased protein feed, reduce purchased protein requirements, and that's by targeting lower crude protein diets and targeting higher nitrogen utilisation within that rumen. So happy enough to take any questions. Hopefully I've left enough time. So diolch yn fawr.